First of all, I would like to thank my dear friend Agustín Echebarren, director of the Fundación Libertad y Progreso, and Peter Goebler, president of the Cato Institute, for allowing me to speak at this meeting today, sharing the program with renowned intellectuals in the liberal academic world, whom I have studied and admired for years. I would like to begin by referring a little to the moment that Argentina is facing and to the titanic political, economic and cultural task that we are undertaking from the national government. A few days after 6 months of our mandate began, I would like to pause for a moment to emphasize the magnitude of the feat that Minister Caputo and his team are carrying out. Because sometimes one hears some politicians or economic analysts, and from what they say, it seems as if they lived in another country. It would seem that they live in Narnia. So let's briefly put the work of our economic team into perspective. In December we inherited twin deficits of 17 points of GDP, a 3-to-1 exchange rate gap between the parallel and official dollar, and a monetary surplus similar to that before the Rodrigazo, an indebted state almost on the verge of default. Prices that were already at 1.5% daily and that combined with the debt of the central bank led us to hyperinflation, with the aggravating factor of having poverty indicators much worse than in the run-up to any other crisis in our history. In other words, in plain English, we received a picture of a situation worse than before the Rodrigazo legacy in terms of monetary imbalance. A situation in the central bank much worse than that which existed at the beginning of 1989, prior to Alfonsin's hyperinflation, and with social indicators that were even worse than those we had in 2001. We were facing what was going to be the worst crisis in all of Argentine history. And it is also worth saying that the government that was leaving was aware of this. It speculated that our libertarian position would decide to open everything instantly. And this is interesting because all the remunerated liabilities had been transferred to one day, with a phenomenal stock imbalance, the Sierra debt for $50 billion, the debt for dividends, debt in pesos maturing for the equivalent of $90 billion, $25 billion of external debt to be paid with multilateral organizations, with the agreement with the fund fallen. A government that, in addition, over the course of 4 years issued for the equivalent of 28 points of GDP, but of those 28, 13 were issued during the last year. And we have to tell them to their face, they expected us to release everything, ignoring the dynamics of the stocks, and that everything would explode so that they would throw people out into the street. Do not rule out their methodology of throwing dead people out into the street, going for looting, something that some journalists promote from their spaces. They cry out for freedom of expression, but they are calling for crimes to be committed, which is also a crime. And in that context, the whole crisis would do the work, the dirty adjustment, and they would return as redeemers at the beginning of 2024. In just 6 months of management, we stopped the financing of the Treasury with monetary emission. We made the largest adjustment of public spending in the history of humanity, and we achieved the first quarter with a fiscal and financial surplus in the national public sector, after 20 years. In that context, we also systematically lowered the central rates, and we are deactivating the debt bomb in pesos. even in a context of high inflation, despite what many said that it could not be done. I also want to mention here, because this is important, when we talked about the adjustment that we were going to make, they said it was impossible. Some shameless people said that it could not be adjusted more than 1 point of GDP when we made the Treasury adjustment. We expected to reach financial equilibrium throughout 2024 and we achieved it in the first month of management. Then they said that we had done it in a cosmetic accounting way. I mean, cosmetic accounting to adjust 5 points of GDP is quite difficult. But those same people who said that we could not adjust more than 1 point later found that not only did we have a financial surplus in January, we had a financial surplus in February, we had a financial surplus in March, we had a financial surplus in April, in May, and we are going to end the first semester with a surplus. And not only that, but, in parallel, we had a quasi-sufficient deficit of 10 points of GDP, and today we have lowered it by 9 points of GDP. We have adjusted up to this point the equivalent of 15 points of GDP. And we did all of that in less than 6 months. I often find it funny when people say, he said he was going to lower taxes and he raised them, and the question is, what do you think seigniorage is? Seigniorage is a scam. We are reducing seigniorage by 15 points of GDP. We are giving people back 15 points of GDP. That is why, while in December we were discussing hyperinflation, something that many dishonest intellectuals also try to put aside by only reporting what was happening with the CPI and not what was happening with the wholesale price index, which was 54%. And that annualized number is 17,000. Wholesale inflation in April was 3.4%, which annualized is 50%. I understand that 50% is an aberration. It is an aberration. But in the alternative scenario, we were traveling at 17,000%. It would be good if they were more intellectually honest. Another discussion that I also find very interesting, and that has great academic value from my point of view, is the discussion of the interest rate, of using it as an instrument of economic policy to control inflation. My displeasure with this manipulation of the interest rate is not new. My displeasure with this Keynesian perspective that the interest rate is determined in the monetary market is not new. Because the interest rate exists, because time exists, not because money exists. It exists because time exists. And it exists with individuals who are willing to move consumption from the present to the future, to save. And there are individuals who are willing to move production from the present to the future, that is, to invest. And therefore, the interest rate is a mechanism of intertemporal coordination, not the result of printing colored pieces of paper. In this context, we consider that inflation is always, everywhere, a monetary phenomenon that is generated by an excess of money supply, either because supply increased or demand fell, or both things happened at the same time, which causes the purchasing power of money to fall, and that implies that all prices expressed in monetary units rise. Therefore, our bet was to stop the issuance of money. We were convinced and we were managing to close the issuance to finance the Treasury, but we had another problem, which was the endogenous issuance of money, if you look closely. The majority of analysts at that time recommended that we set the interest rate at positive real levels. If we had listened to them, today the relationship between remunerated liabilities and monetary base would be above 8. We would be discussing the problem of the carry trade. We would be discussing the Lalique bomb, and lowering inflation would be literally impossible. However, we decided to arbitrate the interest rate in dollars. It implied a negative real interest rate in pesos, and that allowed us to put the central bank's balance sheet in order. At the same time, with the fiscal surplus, that also allowed us to substantially reduce the country risk and allowed us to recreate a debt market for government debt. In a monumental task carried out by the Secretary of Finance Pablo Cuerno, and who, in conjunction with the President of the Central Bank, began to mutate the debt that was in the central bank. To take it to where it originally should have been, in relation to the financing of the fiscal imbalance, which was in the Treasury accounts. That means that today, the relationship of remunerated liabilities with respect to the monetary base is 1.2 times. That is to say, we reduced it to a third. But it is important to have an idea of the quantitative notions of that. Today we have a monetary base of 15 billion pesos and we have remunerated liabilities of 18 billion pesos. Now, the interesting thing is that of those 18 billion pesos, 12 billion are in the hands of public banks. Of those 12 billion, 7 are in the Banco Nación, where the counterpart is that there are 3.5 billion in treasury deposits within the Banco Nación. Therefore, there are 7 that are not a problem. There are 3 that are in the hands of the Banco Provincia Buenos Aires. I say, although the communist dwarf is an enemy of freedom and especially of this government. The fact that he has a fiscal deficit makes him use the Banco Provincia as a financing mechanism, and he has such a tight position in liquidity that he cannot move it from there. And, what remains? A large part is with the government of the city. Therefore, the real problem that we face is 6 billion pesos. And think that we have had, in some of the placements, offers for 18 billion pesos. That is to say, the problem of remunerated liabilities, that problem of endogenous issuance, we have practically cornered. However, I also want to state that once we finish with that, there is still one final stage to resolve the problem of the cepo, which is to resolve the problem of the puts. This is probably one of the biggest perversions committed by the previous government. Faced with the bank's unwillingness to finance the treasury, they indirectly used the central bank. And in a way that also had the complicity of the International Monetary Fund, they financed it with instruments that are puts. So, what is the problem? Within the balance sheet of the central bank, What appears is the amount of the put and not the contingent liabilities that are open. To give you an order of magnitude, these contingent liabilities represent 4 points of GDP. When today the monetary base is 2.8, imagine what it would be like to throw all that amount of money out on the street. Imagine, and be aware of this, that they are not even European puts. Where you have defined the term at which they expire, they are American puts and they can be executed at any time. Therefore, once we finish with the remunerated ones, what we are doing is working on the solution to the problem of the puts in order to definitively open the trap. In this context, we are also confident because today, between what we have in monetary base and remunerated liabilities, this already amounts to 6 points of GDP. When historically the base demand in the 21st century fluctuated between 8 and 9 points of GDP. Therefore, once we finish solving the problem of the puts, I promise that we will definitively open the cepo. So, having said these references both in the fiscal and monetary areas, as a result of the fiscal anchor and the monetary anchor, inflation has been falling sharply for the last 5 months. What's more, in a few days the inflation data for May will be known and everything indicates that it will be below 5 points. In short, our stabilization program is demonstrating its effectiveness. I would also like to mention the intellectual dishonesty of many of our colleagues. Because I may be president, but I am not stopping being an economist, nor will I stop being one. Also, after this I have to continue earning a living as a speaker. That's why I gave up my privileged pension to make it clear. So, well, they took me out of the speech. I've been out of the speech for a while now. But anyway, I'll continue. What I think is the issue of the intellectual dishonesty of our colleagues, and one has to understand the characteristics of who makes the decisions. A stabilization program basically has 3 parts. It has a fiscal policy, an adjustment policy, a monetary policy, and an exchange policy. Obviously, as a result of having our brains washed for more than 100 years with socialist and dirigiste policies, they believe that there have to be sectoral things, that prices have to be controlled, that the dynamics of this price have to be managed, that the other has to be controlled. Guys, I'm a libertarian liberal, I'm not going to do that kind of crap. I believe in freedom. I don't believe that politicians are gods. Furthermore, another thing that seems deeply intellectually dishonest to me is that, apart from the fact that inflation is going down, by magic, inflation is going down, there is a program that is what is bringing down inflation. And in that sense, it surprises me because if one has the evidence, one should at least be more sincere. But we are also doing it in a context where we are recomposing relative prices. Therefore, when one wants to look at inflation, they don't like to look at wholesalers because it proves that they were wrong and that things are working much better than they expected. I understand that. But when they are going to look at inflation, I say the most intellectually honest thing would be to look at the core. But no, it doesn't matter, let them continue denying the achievements. Obviously they don't see it. So, it seems to me that we should be looking at the core. Still, you know what? No problem. Because not only are we going to be beating the core, but we are also going to beat the general inflation. We are going to crush inflation. And, as if this were not enough, we have governed these first 6 months of the year uphill, managing the worst legacy in history and without the legislative power or the instruments that all governments before ours have had. This is not a minor issue. It is not that politics did not support us. Politics, since before taking office, has put obstacles in our way. They put obstacles in our way by breaking the balance sheet of the central bank. And they put obstacles in our way every day that we try to govern. But, you know what? All this is proving that the ideas of freedom are stronger, because despite the filthy political caste, we are achieving it. We are defeating inflation. But the country needs profound changes, basic economic reforms that go beyond the immediate economic policy decisions that a president can make. And today, while the most ambitious economic, social, tax and fiscal reform project since the return of democracy is being discussed in the nation's Senate, there can be no doubt that Argentina is at a turning point. We can insist on the path that brought us here, insist on the model of the present state, but which is really only present for some and plunges the rest into misery. We can insist on the model of unbridled spending, of a productive interior drained and outraged by politics from Buenos Aires, of suffocating tax pressure, of debt, of monetary emission, of discouragement of economic activity and of bureaucracy that hinders everything. Or alternatively, we can return to the path to freedom from which we should never have strayed. To return to the ideas and values that once made Argentina a world power, to return to the defense of life, liberty and private property, and aspire to be a country that lives up to our identity and our history once again. The bad thing is that we have wasted a lot of time. We wasted a century's worth of time. 100 years ago we squandered the stock of resources, wealth and advantages that our golden age bequeathed us. We squandered it in the service of nothing, in the service of chimeras. We went from being a power to being a country with mediocre results. Even though our people are not mediocre, they are exceptional. The model of social justice and the present state tied the hands and plunged an exceptional people into misery, and unfortunately we will never be able to recover this time. The good thing is that Argentine society, for the first time in years, mobilized to demand a radical change in direction. It elected as president someone who, during his campaign, assumed and dared to tell truths that any other politician would have hidden with shame. Society chose the path of freedom, knowing all the costs and sacrifices that this entailed in the short term. And it chose it with the largest number of individual votes in the history of Argentine democracy. However, for some politicians the popular mandate of nearly 15 million Argentines meant nothing. Because their priority is not the society that loudly demands change, it is not the country that needs to be put back on track to prosper, but their personal and groveling interest of the political caste that resists making reforms because they know that if they do, this will work and will never come back.
Por eso, a 6 meses de haber asumido nuestro gobierno,
That is why, 6 months after our government took office, they are still doing everything possible to prevent our program from prospering. Over the 100 years that we have already lost, they make us continue to waste time, because they know that our program puts at risk the unjust system that they feed on. This is not the first time I have said this. The history of the last 100 years of our country allows us a glimpse, a small window into what could happen to the rest of the free world if it lowers its guard and lets itself be seduced by socialism. Because the same ideas that are in vogue today among the elites of the West are the ones that destroyed freedom in Argentina and condemned us to poverty. Ideas that possibly in some cases come from a noble cause, which is to give assistance to the weakest or those who have the least. But they have a flaw at their root, which is state intervention as an instrument to impart social justice. They have to understand that charity is good, but if it is done with one's own pocket, as Rothbard said. It is incredible how infinitely charitable people can be, when the pocket that pays is someone else's. In this context, the state is neither in its right, nor is it capable of imparting justice through the distribution of wealth, because social justice is a mistaken concept at a moral, theoretical and empirical level. On the moral level, because every act of distribution implies the act of prior coercion, which is confiscating the property of a private individual that is his by natural right. This means that the state is a criminal and violent organization, as long as it is financed by a coercive source of income called taxes. On the theoretical level, because by definition the greater the state intervention, the less free the markets are and the worse they function, producing misery instead of wealth. As Hayek said, every time the state intervenes, it generates a worse result than if it had not interfered. Why? Because state intervention introduces distortions in the price system, prevents correct economic calculation and, consequently, nullifies what Hayek called the correct functioning of the market as a process of discovery. That is, in the constant search to compete in the market, the capitalist finds the right path. But this can only happen in a system of free prices that better extract and transmit information about the quantities of which goods or services are demanded and at what price. Collectivism, by inhibiting this process of discovery and making it difficult to appropriate what has been discovered, ties the entrepreneur's hands and makes it impossible for him to produce better goods and offer better services at a better price. And finally, as if all this were not enough, there is also empirical evidence of the inferiority of socialism. If we look at the indices of economic freedom, the freest countries have a GDP per capita 12 times larger than the repressed ones. And even the inhabitants of the lowest decile of the free system live better than 90% of the population of the repressed countries. So free enterprise capitalism is superior to socialism even in the main task that they claim socialism does better, which is to help the underprivileged. What is at the base of all this is that there is a direct and proven relationship between repression and misery, on the one hand. And on the other hand, there is a proven relationship between freedom and prosperity. And socialist ideas are fundamentally incompatible with prosperity, precisely because they are incompatible with freedom. The elimination of competition is incompatible with the defense of merit and effort. Bureaucratic control is incompatible with creativity and innovation. Directed distribution is incompatible with the generation of wealth, and at the bottom, a large state with broad powers that gets involved in each of the private affairs of the people is incompatible with having a free, creative and thriving society that can generate wealth for itself and for future generations. Today it seems that Argentina and a good part of the free world are turning in opposite directions. While some Western powers are forgetting the basic rules that brought the prosperity they enjoyed in recent decades, Argentina is rediscovering those ideas and values and is once again betting on the model of freedom. While developed countries are becoming heavy on regulations, on unjustified impositions, We are removing the regulations that have been tying the hands of our people for decades, and we are inviting the capitals of the world to cooperate with Argentina. Because we understand free economic activity as the most natural act of cooperation for the human species. That is, in Argentina we are rediscovering the ideas that made the modern West the greatest feat of civilization and economic development in human history. And we want to be a refuge for those who defend and live these ideas throughout the planet. There has always been a struggle between those who innovate and those who regulate, between those who generate and those who confiscate, between those who explore the territory and those who then draw the maps and trace the boundaries. There has always been and will always be a struggle between the private sector and the state. Today, in the technology sector, which is the most dynamic sector of the global economy, this struggle is palpable. The great visionaries of the sector are fleeing from the regulations that the global political leadership infected with socialism seeks to impose on them. I am telling you today what I have already told these actors in person. This Argentina is on the side of the private sector, not the state. It is on the side of those who work, those who trade, those who strive. It is on the side of those who risk, invest, innovate. As I said, it is on the side of those who risk, invest, and innovate, who are by nature social benefactors and will defend tooth and nail the ideas of freedom, because we know that in them lies the formula for prosperity. But it is not just about having the right ideas. We must also have material conditions that support us. Because after decades of stagnation, Argentina has everything in place to undertake a process of economic convergence that will put us on par with the great powers of the world in a few decades. Ultimately, the question is, what is the process of convergence? Here it is also worth making a methodological note about what we economists do, right? Because convergence is something that when you look at the history of humanity, those who embrace the ideas of freedom achieve it. But our growth models are simplified behind certain formats of the production function. And in reality, we do not even have the basis for why it ends up converging. Ultimately, it arises based on the concavity of the production function and how far we are from the equilibrium of the stock of capital per capita of the stationary state. Ultimately, we are only talking about a mathematical relationship, and it is empty of content. Convergence does not happen by chance, because if it did, any country that was lagging behind could undoubtedly grow without doing anything, and that is false. That is why I emphasize so much in two works, in Hayek's work and in Locke's work, which is synthesized by Israel Kirzner, this idea of the market as a process of discovery and Locke's principle of appropriation, in a context where property rights are respected. If you do that, convergence will happen, because there are a lot of things that needed to be discovered and others have already discovered them. And that is why throughout the history of humanity it takes fewer and fewer years to double the GDP per capita. The first to achieve this was England, which took 58 years. But the last to do so was China, which did so in 7 years. Moreover, in 14 years it quadrupled its GDP per capita. Because it doubled it once and doubled it again, and it did so based on the push from the areas freed up to the market. So it is not that convergence is something that is going to happen in a tautological way, because of the form of the production function, which also has no empirical counterpart. Because the empirical counterpart is increasing returns, not decreasing marginal returns. And there, the key is precisely that what is in the background, and what is in the background are the ideas of freedom. In some of the slides that I saw from this conference, for example, it showed the relationship between the GDP per capita between free and repressed countries. What is more, not only that, free countries grow more than twice as much as repressed ones. So, the key lies there, in the institutional framework that allows convergence. And if you add to that the improvements we are seeing in terms of technology, especially with artificial intelligence, this convergence can be accelerated. So, Argentina has today, if our reform is successful, the opportunity to begin this process of convergence to reach living standards similar to the most developed countries on Earth. More or less, to give you an idea, the largest structural reform that was made in Argentina in history was that of Menem in the 90s. The reform that we are sending in the lay basis is 5 times larger than that. And if you add to that the DNU, which is still standing, we are making structural reforms 8 times larger than what was the largest reform in Argentine history. And then the shameless ones come to say that there is no plan. What's more, if this first phase is successful, we would climb 90 places in economic freedom, and we would begin to look like countries like Germany, like France, like Italy. But that is not enough for me. One could think of Ireland, except for what it is doing at this moment. I mean, what has happened with pro-market reforms has made Argentina the most miserable country in Europe. And today it has a per capita demand 50% higher than that of the United States, and that could be a model. It also falls short of our ambitions. We still have 3,200 structural reforms pending. We are going to carry them out whether the politicians want it or not. And we are going to make Argentina the freest country in the world. And then there are the issues of the current situation as well. Because for decades we have been a pressure cooker boiling with the lid closed. The only thing we have to do is uncover it and resume the task of the market as a process of discovery, where the low capitalization of the economy, the result of 20 years of populism bent on destroying capital, already generates enormous investment opportunities for those who bet on the country. Thus, by reducing the deficit, reducing the tax burden on economic activity, staunchly defending property rights, we will have to achieve that development stops being a dream and becomes a reality. But not only can we make the right decisions regarding economic freedom and respect for property rights, we can converge in a relatively short period of time to the wealth levels enjoyed by the main powers of the world today. But economic convergence for us is simplified, because we do not have to go through this laborious process of discovery that Hayek spoke of, since others have done it for us, which was what he was explaining about the foundations of convergence. There is nothing to invent to reach the wealth levels of the main countries of the world. We only have to generate the conditions of respect for private property so that the actors of the private world can take the knowledge of those who have already carried out the process of economic discovery and reproduce it. that facilitates the process of wealth generation and economic growth. That is, they have already done the work for us. This facilitates the process of wealth generation and economic growth. In other words, they have already done the work for us. The arduous process of discovery in which an actor finds a need and develops a product or service to satisfy it has already occurred and occurs every day where property rights are respected. Because without appropriation, there is no possible discovery process. That is why socialism failed and will always fail, because it inhibits the process of appropriation of what has been discovered, destroying innovation and, consequently, the generation of wealth. For this reason, because the private sector learns from the discovery process of others, economic growth at a global level has been accelerating for more than 100 years and is accelerating more and more. If we add to this the technological tools we have today, such as artificial intelligence, this process of economic convergence to reach the living standards of developed countries may even be much shorter than we think. All this means that, in a single generation, Argentina could go from being a poor country to one of the most important countries in the world. All we need is to embrace the ideas of freedom again, to defend life and property. So, I want to go back to something that I said in recent weeks to the most powerful businessmen in the world. In the technological sectors that are the frontiers of economic activity, Argentina was once a land of promise, which captured the imagination of adventurers and entrepreneurs because everything was yet to be done, because they knew they could invest their effort and capital and they would do well. Because there was a state that protected property rights and protected the freedom of association between private individuals. Today we have everything to go down that path again and become the new Mecca of the West. We have the natural resources that the world needs, ready to be used. We have the best human capital in the region, curious and trained to face the challenges of the present. And for the first time in 150 years, we are becoming a freer country every day. With these conditions, we have the opportunity to be at the forefront of technological and energy development, as we already are in the agricultural sector. For example, we can be a global development hub in artificial intelligence, which is a highly demanding and highly remunerative market, which will facilitate a leap in productivity in an immense number of value chains in the economy and which will also allow us to reform the state so that it works better and stops wasting taxpayers' resources. You already know that as the economy grows, I will keep spending under control. For what? To return the money to those who genuinely and originally generated it, the private sector. In this sense, we have the obligation to take advantage of this opportunity. We owe it to good Argentines to show them that their effort is for something, that work and sacrifice correspond to an improvement in their quality of life. I want to remind Argentines what we forgot after accumulating failure after failure, but what the rest of the world has known over the last 100 years, that economic freedom brings prosperity and brings prosperity for all, not just for some. For all this, returning to my initial idea, today as a society, as a country and as a political leadership we are facing a fork in the road. Either we persist on the path of decadence or we dare to walk the path of freedom. This battle is even taking place in the streets. Fortunately, we have a great Minister of Security who is putting the streets in order, as we promised in our campaign. Society has already chosen which of the two paths is open to it and wants to take it. It has already taken the risk that choosing freedom implies. And, from the presidency, we are embarking on that path with the tools we have. Now it is the turn of the rest of politics to decide whether to support or turn its back on the popular mandate to live in a freer country with a more dynamic economy, or whether to insist on persisting on the path of servitude, condemning us all to misery. There is still time to work together and show society that the political leadership can rise to the occasion of its demands. We have no other ambition than to generate the material and spiritual conditions for Argentina to become a prosperous country again. We are not interested in political power as an end in itself. We are not interested in gaining anything on a personal level. We are here willing to leave everything in the service of our cause, even if it costs us our own personal well-being. If we manage to generate the stability necessary to reactivate economic activity, if we manage to make way for freedom, if we manage to remove the state as much as necessary so that society can flourish, we will have succeeded. Because free economic activity will redound to benefits for the common people of society. If we achieve this, it will not be our triumph, but rather a triumph of society as a whole, which will have managed to leave behind 100 years of statism and decadence. Therefore, while we travel the road to that new Argentina, I thank all of you for being here. God bless the Argentines and may the force of heaven be with us. Long live freedom, damn it. Long live freedom. Damn it. Long live freedom, damn it.
Muchas gracias.